This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust. I'm Dougal Stevenson. As it's near the end of the year, we thought we would bring to you what we think are some of our best programs in 2025, and here's one we first ran in March. In this program, Bill Southworth tells us about the Kaitangata mine disaster. Gregor Campbell reports on the death of a Dunedin miser. Alison Breeze looks at the history of 3 Dunedin post offices, and we finish with a scorching letter about a financial scandal involving a local Anglican bishop. New Zealand coal mining has a sad history of miners being killed by gas explosions. The worst was at the Brunner mine on the west coast in 1896, which killed 65 miners. And there were 2 others at Huntly and another 3 on the west coast. Here in Otago, one occurred in a small township near Balclutha. This report from Bill Southworth.
At 9 a.m. on February the 21st, 1879, the houses in Kaitangata shook with vibrations. The shuddering was coming from its coal mine and was caused by a catastrophic gas explosion. A massive debris shot skywards. A boy just entering the mine with a horse, and he and the animal were blown 50 yards. The boy was killed, and the horse was so badly injured it later had to be put down. A house many yards away from the mouth of the mine was hurled off its foundations and partly wrecked. Down below in the mine, a gas explosion had caused the death of 34 men and boys, leaving 25 widows and 100 fatherless children. Wives and children crowded around the pit mouth, anxious for news of husbands and fathers. The searchers worked desperately, but in the foul air they quickly became exhausted. In fact, some nearly suffocated and had to be dragged out into the open air to recover. In her book on the disaster, author Alma Rutherford wrote,
"The experienced miners present recognised the ominous signs, noticing the effect of the afterdamp, the choking, oxygen-less gases following the explosion. They knew now there was no hope of rescuing any of the men alive. For the women and their children watching from the knoll, the anguish must have been almost unbearable."
Shortly after noon, the first body was brought to the surface. Then came 3 more. All had been found no more than 200 yards from the pit entrance. The tension mounted, but the magnitude of the calamity was still not realised.
"None dreamed that such an accident at one of our mines was possible," said the Dunedin Age. "The absence of explosions hitherto had induced the belief that our mines were altogether different from the old, deep pits of the mother country."
But our mines were no different. Methane gas, which miners call fire damp, explodes when it comes into contact with flame, and it is the same in mines the world over. Almost unbelievably, in New Zealand, miners up until then were allowed to take naked flames into the mines. Some even wandered around with candles attached to the front of their caps. The searchers struggled further into the workings. By 9 o'clock that night, 28 bodies had been recovered, and 4 more had been seen under the wreckage. There were pitiful cries at the pit head as each body was lifted out into the open. The search for bodies went on through the next day. No bodies were found at the point where the men had been working, and most of them were in a spot where no explosion had occurred. This, together with the fact that most bodies were not blackened or mutilated, suggested that an explosion of fire damp had occurred, and the coal cutters had time to flee, but were caught in a belt of afterdamp or carbon acid gas and suffocated. It seemed they may have been crawling on the ground as the methane, being lighter than air, floated near the roof of the mine shaft. Alma Rutherford again.
13 men were found in one place 300 metres from the mouth, all lying on their faces, as if they had been making for the entrance. They appeared to have taken up that position to avoid the afterdamp. William Hodge, the manager, was found in a reclining position on a ledge of coal, his head on one hand, as if he had been caught by the fatal blast while reflecting. They were not bruised or marked in any way, except for a few traces of slurry where they had lain on the floor of the drive, and the faces of a number of the men wore a remarkably peaceful expression.
The bodies were taken to the Bridge Hotel. Until then, many of their relatives had had no opportunity to identify them. Eventually, the wives and children were allowed in. There followed a pitiful scene as they identified their loved ones and gave vent to their grief. A few days later, most of the dead were buried in a graveyard on a ridge about 500 metres from the town. Special trains were put on to bring mourners in, and over 1,000 attended the mass burial. So, what caused the fatal gas explosion? It emerged that Archie Hodge, the deputy manager and brother of William Hodge, had entered an old part of the mine to get some rails for the coal bins to run on. The old workings were virtual reservoirs of inflammable gas. The miners told of small explosions earlier in the tunnels and the presence of the dreaded gases. The system of ventilation was shown to be inadequate. Although safety lamps were available, Archie Hodge had entered the darkness carrying a tallow lamp with a naked flame. He was regarded as being somewhat eccentric, and some miners had complained that he was, quote, given to poking around in all parts of the workings night and day with a naked light. They complained to the manager about his brother, but he shrugged his shoulders and admitted he couldn't make the old fellow keep out. The whole affair provoked trenchant criticism in the press. The Littleton Times went so far as to say that this man
probably carried his flaring light into disused workings, and in the act destroyed the township.
The evidence at the inquiry certainly suggested that one of the men had gone into the old workings with a naked light and triggered the explosion. The eccentric deputy manager died with his companions.
Every precaution which ought to have been taken in the mine seems to have been neglected, commented the New Zealand Herald. Anyone could go into the old workings with a naked light. The ventilation was defective.
The Littleton Times, after reviewing all the evidence at the inquiry, took the mine owners severely to task. It pointed out that there was no chairman of directors. The manager, William Hodge, though confessedly unskilled, was responsible to nobody. An incompetent manager had been carrying out a system known to many to be bad and dangerous. He had made light of the fire damp known to be in the mine, even when one man was seriously burned some time before. There were strong demands throughout the country for tightening the law concerning the condition in mines. At the time of the disaster, there was a rudimentary system of mine safety inspection. There were mines inspectors, but each had a large area to cover and could only spend a few hours at each mine. Crucially, they had no power to enforce safety measures or shut down mines they found to be unsafe. The inquiry that followed found
that Archibald Hodge, through entering the old workings without ordinary precautions and with a naked light, caused an explosion of fire damp, whereby 34 men and boys lost their lives. Second, the jury find that William Hodge had not used the necessary precautions to prevent an explosion of the fire damp over which he had the management. As a rider, we add that seeing that there is no law for the inspection and supervision in the conduct of mining, we express the necessity of measures being enacted, whereby many accidents may in the future be averted.
A week after the disaster, an 1874 Regulation of Mines Act, which had not been enforced and had been allowed to lie dormant for a number of years, was speedily brought into operation. The New Zealand Times newspaper noted at the time,
"The existing law may require amendment, but if it had been in operation as it ought to have been, and its provisions carried out under competent inspection, it's not too much to say that the catastrophe at Kaitangata would have been prevented."
Those who forget history are condemned to relive it. 130 years later, the Royal Commission on the Pike River mine explosion, which killed 29 men, found a series of failures for the tragedy and commented,
"These failings were compounded by the failure of government regulatory authorities to effectively inspect the mine and to remedy the problems."
For much of this material, I'm grateful to Eugene Grayland for his book, New Zealand Disasters, Alma Rutherford for her book, the Kaitangata mine disaster of 1879, and also to Denise Dent for her book Blood on the Coal. This is Bill Southworth reporting.
In the 1920s, the death of a Dunedin miser who owned an astonishing number of houses caused some consternation after police searched his dirty and dilapidated home. This report from Gregor Campbell.
In 1924, the Southland Times reported on a minor Dunedin sensation. The sudden death of a person in Dunedin's slum area was not novel, but Patrick McCarthy had a secret or two. Money and filth. Remarkable Dunedin case. A miser's hoard. Constable's unenviable task. There are some remarkable features about the life of Patrick McCarthy, an old man who died in the home at Carroll Street the other day. McCarthy was living under conditions of squalor, yet he was a man of considerable estate, being the owner of at least 17 houses in the city. The police found more than £1,000 in notes, stuck about all parts of the building, in mattresses and in walls. The place in which he lived was in a most filthy condition, and an experienced police officer describes the work of searching it as the most disgusting job he has had. So far as is known, the deceased has no relations in New Zealand, but a number will probably be developed. The Christchurch Star had more details of the discoveries at Mr. McCarthy's house. Poor man's hoard. Death of Patrick McCarthy. If any will was left by Mr. Patrick McCarthy, the elderly man who died in a small house in McCarthy's Lane off Carroll Street on Friday, it has not yet been discovered. Deceased owned about 17 houses in the lane which bore his name, mostly small, but a very presentable two-storey building faces onto Carroll Street. The ground, which is freehold, must be worth a considerable amount of money. It is adjacent to the large brick building recently built by the Bell Tea Company and has a frontage of 66 feet and a depth of almost 180 feet. The small houses, some of a single room, were let at rentals of from 4 shillings to 8 or 9 shillings. The large shop and a small two-storey brick house situated in the middle of the wooden houses would, of course, bring more. An old man who lives in the right-of-way stated that he had known Mr. McCarthy off and on for the past 30 years. He had first met him at the Mount Royal station. At that time, McCarthy was a cook on the station. McCarthy often used to speak of the village where he was born, Thurles, in Tipperary. He used to say that he had a brother in America. Mr. McCarthy has occupied himself in pottering about the lane, doing odd mending jobs on the buildings, etc. He had lived in Dunedin for 22 years. Details of the property of deceased are as follows. Cash, £209, 12 and 6, 8 New Zealand government bonds for £100 each, a silver watch and a chain. The police report states that the sum of £18, 12 and 6 was discovered on a table in the deceased's room, and in a box alongside there was a sum of £800 in New Zealand government bond certificates. On making a further search of deceased's house, 2 sums of money in notes, mainly £100 and £91 were discovered. The police state that the deceased was supposed to be a wealthy man with property and money in the bank, although they are unable to find a bank book. It is therefore uncertain in the meantime if the money found represents the whole estate with the property of the deceased. Deceased's house was in a filthy state, and it was apparent that he had lived the life of a miser. There was no food in the house. There were a great many tools there, however. The estate has been placed in the hands of the public trustee, and in due course steps will be taken to discover the whereabouts of any relatives of the deceased. If no relations are found, the property will go into the consolidated fund. The 20 or so properties in all owned by Patrick McCarthy were auctioned in January of 1925. Patrick was buried in Andersons Bay Cemetery. It is a shame that none of his estate was spent on a gravestone. And I'm the very much alive Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
Dunedin used to have many more post offices than it has today. Alison Breeze has been looking at the history of 3 that were designed by the same architect, a man who began his career in Dunedin.
The Rārangi Kōrero Heritage New Zealand list is constantly evolving and being updated with new listings and upgrades. Recent upgrades I have added include 3 local post office buildings. You may have wondered about these buildings, which are prominent landmarks around Dunedin. If you haven't, you can pay more attention to them now. The post office has dramatically changed as a service, but the impressive buildings still remain, giving us a tangible link to the interesting postal service of the past. The postal service in New Zealand began in 1840, and the first post office in Dunedin opened in 1855. By the early 20th century, the Post and Telegraph Department had become one of the major government departments, with branches in all the main centres. John Campbell, born 1857 and died in 1942, government architect, designed many of the country's post offices. Campbell established the architectural style of Edwardian Baroque as the official architectural style for government buildings in New Zealand in the early 20th century. Campbell arrived in Dunedin in 1882, where he worked briefly for the firm Mason & Wales. The following year, he was appointed to a temporary position in the Public Works Department in Dunedin. At the end of 1888, Campbell was transferred to Wellington, where on the 1st of April 1889 he became draftsman for the Public Buildings Department. That department merged with the Public Works Department the next year, and Campbell's title became architect in 1899. Campbell oversaw the architectural design of government buildings until his retirement in 1922, holding the title of government architect from 1909. Between 1900 and 1914, a post office boom occurred in New Zealand, and due to this large amount of work, Campbell developed 2 models for smaller post offices which were built throughout New Zealand. This boom was influenced by a few things: the completion of the main trunk line in the North Island, along with the replacement of old timber buildings with more permanent material structures, and the spread of telegraphic communication throughout New Zealand. The 3 post offices I will feature today are the Mornington, Roslyn, Waikawaiiti offices. All of these were originally in separate boroughs, each with their own mayor and council, and they merged over time into what is now Dunedin City. They were very much part of the post office building boom and replaced earlier smaller buildings in each of these boroughs. Mornington. The laying of Mornington's foundation stone was a very large ceremony in 1905. However, unusually, it did not have a grand opening, maybe because of the grand foundation stone event. Construction was completed at the end of 1905. Mornington's post office was built of brick with cement facings and had a public room for letters, stamps and money orders, and a mail room with a postmaster's room, which included a sitting room, bedroom and kitchen. There were 2 telephones, one for telegraph services and one for the public bureau telephone. The contractor for this building is a little confusing, as multiple sources have the name recorded differently. P.A. Leiders is mentioned as the contractor in the Evening Star and Otago Daily Times. But another later article names F.W. Leiders as the contractor, and a tender document held at Archives New Zealand names P.A. Riders as the contractor. And frustratingly, this item was missing, so I couldn't do a quick check to see if it was potentially a typo. Frederick Wilton Leiders and Peter Andrew Leiders were brothers who were listed as building contractor and builder, respectively, in the obituaries and directories. And there was another brother, Henry, as well, which is recorded in 1904 directories. So it could have been the pair of these builders or one of these men. We may never know. The Mornington Postal Services ceased on the 27th July 1990, and various modifications to the interior have been carried out since. All 3 of these post offices are on the DCC district plan, with protections only required for the facades. This building in Mornington, with its rich Baroque decoration, remains a focal point and provides an important contribution to the streetscape. Most of the towers of the post offices of this type of design no longer exist, with the Mornington Post Office being one of the 6 that remains. Another of these 6 just happens to be the Roslyn Post Office. This post office was constructed in 1907 by contractor Robert Orr. The completion of construction was the 18th December 1907, and it officially opened in the 25th of February 1908. Roslyn's post office was also built with an imposing clock tower, and the roof was originally of Marseille tiles. The space included a telephone bureau, a mail room, and a postmaster's room with a permanent postmistress, and accommodation was on the first floor. Postal services here ceased on the 5th of February 1988, but the building continued to house a post bank that many people may remember until the 20th of March 1992. Since the 1990s, it has housed a real estate office downstairs, and the second floor has remained as residential accommodation. In 2018, the building had an exterior repaint and a new roof, as well as a kitchen and bathroom upgrades. The third post office is in a different style, but still designed by John Campbell, and it's the Waikouiti Post Office. This post office was built in 1907 as a one-storey early Renaissance-style building. It is built in double brick with cement dressings. The Waikouiti Post Office can claim to be the first post office opened under the Dominion in 1907. This is where New Zealand ceased to be a colony and became a dominion within the British Empire. The foundations of the post office were large, and more than 100 years later there are no cracks in the main building. The front elevation has a central feature of a large arched window with a flagstaff. On either side are arched entrances, one side originally to the public office and the other leading to a private letterbox lobby. The public portion of the building contained a vestibule, a private box lobby, a mailroom, public office, telephone bureau, and a separate telephone room connected with the mailroom. The residential accommodation consists of a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, kitchen and a scullery at the back of the building. And the contractors for this one were Mr. Robson and Crawford. Only one of the outbuildings from the original post office build remains, the small brick shed that is included on the original plans. This once held the copper for washing, a toilet and a place to store coal for the fires. The manual exchange in the post office was dismantled many decades later and was replaced by an automatic exchange that was built in nearby Beach Street. To this day, there are still a lot of telephone wires under the floor of the room where the manual exchange once was. Since 1989, it has been used as a residence and art studio of potter Peter Gregory and painter Laura Gregory. You can find these stories and more on our heritage list online at heritage.org.nz shortly. This is Alison Breeze for Heritage New Zealand Pohiri Tonga reporting for Heritage Matters.
Anglican Bishop Samuel Neville was a man who lived in some style in his splendid mansion in North Dunedin's Leith Valley. But he also found himself entangled in an embarrassing financial dispute which evoked some fiery correspondence.
In 1905, Bishop Samuel Neville, the first Anglican Bishop of Dunedin, was the appellant to a court decision regarding a sum of money attached to his late wife. The New Zealand Truth reported on the case, and the reaction of one person as follows. And I should note here that this broadcast is the reaction of one person only and is not the opinion of myself, Access Radio, or the Southern Heritage Trust. This was an action brought on a bond made by the defendant on July 6, 1876, by which he was to pay Mr. James Parker Penny, his heirs, executors and assignees, £10,000 with interest. The amount was to be paid within 6 months of the death of the defendant's wife Mary, who died on November 27, 1905, and who was daughter of James Parker Penny. The defence was that the bishop, when he made the bond, did not understand its meaning. He thought that it was to last only for a particular time, viz. While he and his wife were travelling from England to New Zealand, in case both should be shipwrecked, in which case the money would go to the wife's father. Defendant married in 1862 Miss Penny, who was heir to the sum of £20,000 and who was also in receipt of an income of £1,500 a year. 10 months after the death of his wife, Dr. Neville married her companion, Mr. Justice Grantham, found for the plaintiffs, remarking that the bond was a just and right one. The money being a wife's, it should go to the wife's family after her death. After reading the above, a Sydney woman wrote and posted a letter to Dr. Neville as follows. To the Right Reverend, the Lord Bishop of Dunedin. My Lord Bishop, will you allow me the pleasure of telling you that I consider you to be a disgrace to the cloth which covers your worldly, sensual, and grasping body. Such as you it is who bring upon religion the healthy contempt of all decent, sane-minded folk, who know the difference between meum et tuum. If you were a man in poor circumstances, you would, much earlier in your career, have been placed in jail by your fellow men, and I, for one, am certain that you are set apart by God as one of the everlasting inmates of His prison. Words cannot express my contempt of you. You marry a woman who, generous creature, brings you what you could never hope to earn by honest brains and manly labour. You live on her money. Skunk. Then, when the kindly hand that has fed you dies, you immediately marry her companion. Oh, worse still. You then hasten to repudiate your moral debt and wriggle out of it through a legal technicality. Shame! You worm in human form! I don't know you nor anyone connected with you or your poor dead wife, but I want to let you know what one person, at least, in the world thinks of you. Despicable mannequin that you are. However, you are betitled, and whatever the purple and gewgaws you wear, you are discovered to all mankind as a Dead Sea fruit, or even worse, for ashes cannot do mean actions and feel venomous greed. Believe me, my Lord Bishop, yours very truly. We may never know the name of the author. It is only to be hoped that the woman from Sydney eventually found the courage to tell us what she really thought. And I'm the less than despicable mannequin, Gregor Campbell, for Heritage Matters.
This show will be replayed on Thursday the 18th of December at 1 p.m. and Sunday the 7th and 21st of December at 7 p.m.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.